If you're here with me tonight, just take a moment to let everything around you go quiet. The day has passed, the night has arrived, and this is where our story begins. It begins not with the first chapter of someone's life, but somewhere in the middle, on a winter night when the air was cold enough to make the world feel fragile and still. Inside the grand, echoing rooms of Harrison Manor, there was a man who thought he knew how every night would end. His name was Robert Harrison, but most called him Bob. At 52 years old, Bob had more wealth than most could even imagine. His mansion stood on the edge of the old Massachusetts district, like a silent monument to fortune. There were chandeliers above his head, rare art on the walls, silver cutlery polished so well it could throw light across a room, but none of it mattered, because for Bob, nights were all the same. He sat at the end of a long dining table that could have seated 20. Yet tonight, like every night, he sat alone. His plate was set before him. Roasted duck, winter vegetables, a glass of deep red wine, the kind of meal most people would consider a celebration. But his fork had barely touched the food. His wheelchair was silent as he moved back from the table. The deep mahogany floor reflected the glow of the firelight, and yet the warmth of the flames could not reach him. Before we continue, please do subscribe to my channel. 20 years had passed since the accident that took his ability to walk. 20 years of waking to the same truth. No matter how much money you had, some things could not be bought back. Outside, through the tall frosted windows, snow drifted, past in slow, lazy spirals. Street lamps cast soft halos into the night, their light broken by the wind's gentle sway. And in that soft glow, far beyond the glass, the world seemed to move on without him. Strangers walking, talking, living, people who could stand on their own feet without thinking about it. He was about to turn away, to retreat into his study as he always did when it happened. A sound, soft at first, like the faintest tap. Then again, not loud, not urgent, just steady. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't at the grand front door that one almost never saw visitors anymore. No, this came from the smaller, less noticeable entrance on the side of the house. The servant's door, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, had left hours ago. He wasn't expecting anyone, and yet the knocking continued. Bob wheeled himself slowly across the polished floor, past portraits of ancestors who all stood tall, frozen forever in proud poses. The air felt cooler near the side hallway. When he reached the door, the sound had stopped. For a moment he thought perhaps it had been nothing, a branch in the wind, maybe. Sighed. A faint breath, he undid the heavy latch and pulled the door open. The winter night reached in first, a bite of cold air, carrying the scent of snow and the faint metallic hush of December. There, standing small against the vast dark, was her. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her coat was far too thin for the weather. It seems worn and frayed. Her shoes had holes where the toes peeked through. The wind tangled her brown hair, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She lifted her chin to look at him, and her voice, soft but steady, rose in the quiet. "Mister, I'm really hungry. Do you have any food you're not going to eat?" For a moment, he could only stare. People didn't come to his door. Not strangers, not neighbors. "Are you doing out here alone?" His voice sounded rough, as if unused for far too long. She glanced over her shoulder, crossed the street, and pointed to a building whose paint had peeled away in long strips, windows fogged from the inside. "I live with my mama over there. She's working late again. Mrs. Patterson from next door told me rich people throw away good food all the time." Her words weren't rude, just honest, pure in a way that made Bob's chest feel strangely tight. "And your name?" he asked quietly. "Lily," she said, her blue eyes meeting his without flinching. "Lily Thompson." Blue like ice under sunlight. But there was warmth there too. "And yours?" He hesitated, then said, "Robert Harrison, but you can call me Bob." She smiled. Just a little, and for the first time in years, something in him softened. "I can make you a deal." "Mr. Bob," she said, stepping forward enough for the porch light to catch the edges of her tangled hair, "you give me some of that food you didn't eat. I'll give you something better." The corner of his mouth almost twitched upward. "And what could you possibly give me, little one? I can make you walk again." The words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. A quiet ripple that spread through him before he could catch it. For a moment, the old anger rose up, hot and familiar. How many doctors had told him they could fix him? How many faith healers, experimental treatments, miracle promises? All ending in disappointment. He'd heard them all, but there was no greed in her eyes, no calculation, just certainty. "You think you can make me walk?" His tone was meant to be skeptical, but it came out softer than he intended. "I know I can," Lily said simply. "I've done it before." He almost laughed. In fact, he did. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from joy. It was hollow, a little bitter, but she didn't flinch. "Come inside," he said at last, and as the door closed behind them, sealing out the winter wind, He didn't realize yet that the rest of his nights would never be the same. The air inside the house wrapped around her, like a blanket, warmer, softer, scented faintly of cedar wood and the slow-burning fireplace in the other room. Bob wheeled himself back a little, giving her space to step inside. She didn't move right away. Her small fingers curled around the edges of her sleeves, tugging them down toward her wrists as she glanced around the wide hallway. Her gaze landed first on the tall grandfather clock, its golden pendulum swaying with a rhythm almost slow enough to lull someone into sleep. Then, her eyes moved to the sweeping staircase. Though she couldn't have known it hadn't been climbed in 2 decades, he cleared his throat gently. "Come in before you freeze out there." It was all it took. She stepped across the threshold, the old wooden floor creaking under the weight of shoes too thin for the snow. A few tiny flakes clung stubbornly to her hair, melting into little droplets that caught the light. "Wait here," Bob said, wheeling toward the dining room. He returned with a porcelain plate, the untouched meal from earlier now rearranged into smaller pieces: roasted duck, buttery potatoes, and a few bright carrots. Lily's eyes widened slightly, though her expression stayed quiet. She took the plate carefully in both hands, like she was holding something fragile. "Sit," Bob said, nodding toward one of the dining chairs. She did. Her legs swung above the floor as she took the first bite, and the next, and the next. Small, quick motions, like someone used to making food last. They didn't speak for a while. The only sounds were the faint hum of the heater and the slow, deliberate ticking of the clock down the hall. When she paused to take a sip of water, Bob asked, "How long have you lived across the street?" "Since last year," she replied. "We used to live near the bus station, but Mama says this place is better, closer to her work." "What does your mother do?" "She cleans at the hotel on River Street. Sometimes she works nights too." There was no complaint in her voice, just a plain stating of facts. Bob's eyes moved over her small frame. The way her sweater sleeves were stretched thin, the faint purple shadows under her eyes. "And when she's working, you're alone?" Psh, nodded once. "Mostly. Mrs. Patterson from next door checks on me sometimes. But she's old, so I don't bother her much." The honesty of her words pressed on him in a way he hadn't expected. "You said something earlier," he began slowly, "about making me walk again." She looked up from her plate. Her blue eyes didn't waver. "Yes, that's a big promise." "It's not a promise," she said gently. "It's just something I know how to do." His lips curved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "First, you have to want it," she said, as if this were the simplest thing in the world. "Most people say they do, but they don't really. You have to want it so much that the rest of you starts to believe it too. And what if I've already tried everything?" She tilted her head, thinking for a moment. "Then you haven't tried me yet," something in her voice, not arrogance, not childish bravado, but quiet certainty made him pause. He'd spent years surrounded by people who either doubted him completely or promised too much. Lily's words didn't feel like either. When she finished eating, she set the plate down with care, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in a strip of worn fabric. She placed it on the table between them and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a charm, no bigger than his thumb, carved from smooth wood. It looked like 2 curved lines meeting in the middle, almost like a pair of footprints touching toes. "What's this?" he asked. "It's for you," she said. "You keep it close, by your bed at night. It's the first step." He picked it up, feeling the lightness of it in his palm. It was warm from her hand, the edges smoothed by time and touch. "And what does it do?" "It reminds your legs what they're supposed to feel like," she said simply. He studied her for a moment. "And you believe that?" She shrugged softly, as if the question didn't need an answer. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It had a softness to it, like snow settling on the ground. Finally, Bob nodded. "All right, Lily, I'll keep it." Her smile was small but real. "I'll come back tomorrow. We'll start then." When she stood to leave, he felt a faint tug in his chest, the kind of reluctance he hadn't felt for another person in years. He wheeled her to the side door, the charm still resting in his hand. The cold rushed in again as he opened it, and she stepped out into the dark, the snow crunching beneath her feet. He watched her cross the street, her small figure disappearing into the shadow of the old apartment building. And when he closed the door, the house didn't feel quite as empty as it had before. That night, Bob set the charm on his bedside table. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he kept looking at it until his eyes finally closed. Morning light filtered softly through the tall curtains, painting pale gold stripes across the floor. Bob stirred in his bed, blinking against the brightness. Usually, mornings felt heavy, a slow, reluctant climb out of sleep into the same unchanging reality. But today, something was different. His eyes drifted almost immediately to the small wooden charm on the bedside table. It sat there quietly, the curves of its shape catching the early light. He had dreamed about walking not in the vague, unreachable way he sometimes did, but vividly. He'd felt the firmness of the ground beneath him, the the shift of muscles he hadn't used in decades. And strangely, the dream hadn't ended with frustration. It had ended with warmth. Bob took a deep breath and pushed his wheelchair toward the window. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving a clean white blanket over the street across the road. The old apartment building stood silent, windows fogged against it. The cold, somewhere in there. Lily was waking too. He was still staring when a knock sounded from downstairs, not the heavy echo of the front door, but the smaller, polite rhythm of the side entrance. Mrs. Chen's voice floated up the stairwell. A moment later, Mr. Harrison, there's a little girl here asking for you. For the first time in years, Bob felt something like a skipped heartbeat. Send her in, he called back, the words almost too quick. He waited in the wide sitting room, and soon Lily appeared. In the doorway, she wore the same worn clothes from last night, but in the morning light she seemed brighter somehow, as if the snow outside had lent her its own glow. Good morning, Mr. Bob, she said softly, stepping inside. She didn't seem shy, but there was a carefulness in the way she moved, like someone who knew how to walk through other people's spaces without leaving a mark. You came back, he said as though it surprised him. I told you I would. Her tone was light, but her eyes were steady. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. I brought you something. He took it from her and unfolded it slowly. It was a simple drawing, a pair of legs, one foot stepping forward, the other following. The lines were a child's. But there was something deliberate in the way the steps were drawn, like motion, captured in stillness. This is for you, she explained. Keep it near the charm, it'll help. Bob glanced between the paper and her face. And how does a drawing help me walk? She gave the smallest shrug. Pictures tell the mind what's real. Sometimes the mind needs reminding before the body listens. Her certainty was almost disarming. He'd spent years listening to medical jargon and mechanical explanations, therapy plans, scientific reports, numbers, and charts, but no one had ever spoken to him in words this simple. All right, he said quietly. What's next? Next, Lily said, setting her small hands on the armrest of his wheelchair. You close your eyes, and you listen. The softness in her voice made him obey before he even thought about it. Imagine you're standing, she began. Just thinking about it, but feeling it. It's the weight of your body balanced between your feet. The air feels different when you're higher up. You can look down and see your toes pointing forward. You can feel the floor through them. Maybe it's cold, maybe it's warm, but you feel it. Her words came slowly, almost like they were meant to weave themselves into the quiet space between heartbeats. And now, you take one step. You. Notice how your weight shifts, how your knee bends, how your other foot lifts without you telling it to. You hear the sound it makes when it meets the ground again. That's one step. Now another. Somewhere in the middle of her instructions, Bob's breath had changed deeper, slower, and deep in his legs. In places he'd long since given up trying to feel, there was the faintest tingling. It was like the echo of something once familiar returning from far away. When she finally told him to open his eyes, he found he'd been gripping the armrests of his chair. He let go slowly, a strange heaviness settling in his chest, not the bad kind, but the kind that came from feeling something real. What did you feel? She asked gently. I don't know, he admitted. But it was something. That's enough for now, she said, as though it were part of a plan she'd already decided on. I'll come again tomorrow. Don't try too hard between now and then. Just remember what we did. He didn't want to admit it, but a small part of him didn't want her to leave, so he walked, or rather, wheeled her to the door himself. Before she stepped out into the snow, she turned back. Bob? Yes, you're closer than you think. She gave a tiny wave and disappeared into the cold. Her small frame swallowed by the white quiet of the morning, Bob stayed by the door for a long time after, looking out at the fresh footprints she'd left behind. They trailed across the street, neat and light, like steps that knew exactly where they were going. The next morning, the snow had quieted the world into a soft, hushed stillness. Edward stirred in bed, the faint crackle of the hearth in the other room lulling him back toward sleep. But then he remembered the conversation from last night. Leal's words still sat in the air like frost that refused to melt. He had promised her something, hadn't he? Or at least implied it. That he would try to help. He'd called it a cure without thinking, though part of him doubted such a thing could exist. Still, couldn't shake the feeling that some invisible thread now connected him to the girl. When Edward finally emerged from his room, Lily was already awake, sitting by the window. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, her chin resting on them. She didn't move as he came closer, but her eyes, clear and watchful, followed him. You don't sleep much, do you? He asked softly. She shook her head. The dreams don't. Let me. He poured water into a kettle and set it over the fire. Then maybe today we'll start with something simple. Step 1. Her brows knit faintly. Step one of what? The cure, Edward said, as if the word was solid enough to stand on. But before we do anything, we need to make sure you're warm, fed, and safe. A person can't heal without those things. Lily tilted her head. That doesn't sound like a cure. Every cure starts with the basics, he replied. You can't rebuild a house if the foundation is broken. She didn't argue, though her gaze slid to the window again, as if she were already thinking about leaving. After breakfast oatmeal, with a little honey, Edward brought out an old coat from the cupboard. It was thick wool, patched in places, but still sturdy. He held it out to her. Lily stared at it, then shook her head. I don't need it, as you do, he said gently but firmly. The snow will cut right through your bones if you walk around in what you're wearing. She still hesitated, her small hands curling into fists at her sides. Edward lowered the coat, his voice softening. It's not charity, Lily. It's armor. Everyone needs armor in the winter. That seemed to reach her. Slowly, she took the coat, slipping her arms into the sleeves. It hung heavy on her, almost swallowing her frame, but she pulled it tight around herself, without looking at him. Better, Edward said with a small smile. Now, step one continues. They went outside, the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Breaking the silence, Edward led her toward the edge of the property, where a line of frost-bitten apple trees stood. Years ago, he began, when I was not in a good place, an old man told me something that stuck. He said the body follows the mind, but sometimes the mind will only follow if the body moves first. Lily glanced at him, frowning slightly. That's confusing, it means. He said, pausing to scoop up a handful of snow, that sometimes the first step to healing is just doing something. Something small, something that reminds you the world still responds to you. He packed the snow into a loose ball and gently tossed it toward her feet. Go on, throw one back. Her mouth twitched not quite a smile, but not the blank mask she usually wore. She crouched, gathered snow in her hands, and tossed it clumsily toward him. It missed. But the movement had broken something in the air. They spent the next 10 minutes tossing snow back and forth, not a game exactly, more of a quiet exchange. No laughter, no shouts, just the rhythm of moving, throwing, catching. When Edward finally lowered his arms, he said, That's it. Step one. She blinked. That's the cure. The first part, he said. To remind you that your hands can still build, your feet can still move, and the world will still answer you. Tomorrow, we start step two. Back inside, Lily sat by the fire while Edward heated soup for lunch. She was quieter than usual, but not in the same way as before. It was a thoughtful quiet, as if she were turning something over in her mind. At one point, she said, almost too softly to hear, Nobody ever tried to cure me before. Edward didn't look up from the pot when they weren't looking closely enough. That evening, the snow began again, gentle, almost lazy flakes drifting past the window. Edward brought out a small box from the top shelf of the cupboard. It was made of dark wood, worn smooth by years of touch. What's that? Lily asked, curiosity pricking through her guarded tone. Something I used to use, he said, opening. It too revealed a deck of well-used playing cards. When my head got too loud, I'd shuffle these until the noise quieted. Want to try? She reached for them slowly, her fingers brushing the edges. The cards made a soft, satisfying SHF, FS, HFF. The sound as she shuffled, clumsy at first, then smoother. Neither of them spoke much after that. She shuffled, he read by the fire. And for a brief stretch of time, the cabin felt balanced, not fixed, not cured, but steadier. Before bed, as Edward banked the fire, Lily lingered in the doorway of her small room. What's step two? She asked. He smiled faintly. You'll see tomorrow. She hesitated, then nodded, closing the door behind her. Edward stood for a moment, listening to the faint sound of her moving around inside. He knew this would not be easy, not for her, and not for him. But he also knew that something had shifted, however slightly. The first step was done. The storm outside had worsened. The wind howled in uneven bursts, rattling the old wooden shutters like some restless spirit circling the cabin. Snow pressed against the glass in thick, shifting layers, and the world beyond was a blur of white. Inside, however, the fire painted, everything in shades of gold and amber, and the crackling logs a steady rhythm against the storm's chaos. Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands cupped around a chipped mug of hot cocoa. The steam rose in soft swirls, carrying the faint scent of cinnamon that I'd sprinkled in just for her. She'd stop shivering, though, every now and then. She'd pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders, almost as if afraid it might vanish. Her eyes kept drifting toward the flames, not in the idle way someone stares into a fire, but with a deep, almost hungry concentration. The light reflected off her pale skin, flickering over the curve of her cheekbones and her small, slightly pointed nose. You like the fire? I asked quietly. She didn't look at me. It's warm. Her voice had the strange mix of hesitation. In certainty, as though she was speaking of something rare and precious. I let the silence rest for a moment, the fire filling in the spaces between us. When I was your age, I began, my grandmother used to tell me stories by the fire. She said the flames liked to listen, and if you told them the right kind of tale, they'd keep you safe through the night. That caught her attention. She turned her head just slightly. Stories. Emham, I said, settling back into the armchair. Some of them were silly about talking animals or enchanted forests. Others, well, they were about people who found courage when they didn't think they had any left. Her eyes searched my face for a moment, as if weighing whether she should ask what she wanted to. Finally, in a small voice, "Can you tell me one?" I smiled. "All right." I chose a gentle one, about a lonely fox who had been too afraid to leave his den until one winter's night, when the snow threatened to bury him. He ventured out, trembling, and discovered that the forest was filled with other creatures who had been waiting all along to help him survive. As I spoke, Lily leaned forward, her cocoa forgotten, her gaze locked on me. Every so often, her lips parted as though she might interrupt, but she never did. When the story ended, she didn't clap or smile. Instead, she whispered, "The fox. Did he ever go back to his den?" I shook my head. No. Once he found the warmth of friends, his den didn't feel like home anymore. She stared into the fire again, her brows knitting just slightly. Then she murmured, "I think I was in my den for a long time." It wasn't a child's playful comment. It was something deeper, something that made the air feel suddenly fragile. I didn't press her, not yet. Instead, I reached over to place another log on the fire, letting the sparks rise and fade like tiny stars. After a while, she asked, "Did you ever hear the story about the girl in the snow?" I froze, my hand lingering near the kindling basket. "I don't think so," I said slowly. "She was lost," Lily began, her voice almost too soft to hear over the storm. "No one knew her name. She knocked on a door and the person inside. They had to decide if they'd let her in. If they didn't, she would disappear like snow when the sun comes." I looked at her carefully. "And did they let her in?" Lips curved into the faintest smile. "You did." There was a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow away. I sat back down, not trusting myself to speak. We didn't talk much after that. I made her another cup of cocoa, and she asked me to tell one more story, this one about a girl who found a hidden garden in the middle of winter. When the fire finally burned low, her eyelids drooped, and she curled into the blanket like it had always been hers. The wind outside could do nothing to touch us there. Not that night, but as I watched her sleep, a question kept circling my mind. If I was the one telling her stories, then whose story had I just stepped into? The wind had quieted outside, but the old cottage still creaked, as though it remembered, the storm's hands pressing against it earlier. The firelight had settled into a low, gentle glow, and Lily sat curled in the old armchair, knees hugged to her chest, staring into the flickering amber light. Margaret was at the table, mending the lining of one of Lily's coats. She didn't speak right away, letting the quiet do its own work. Sometimes she had learned. Silence was not a void to be filled. It was a space in which a child could gather courage. Finally, Lily's voice came, small and hesitant. "Do you remember things from a long time ago?" Margaret set down the needle, sensing the weight behind the question. "I remember quite a lot," she said softly. "Some of it feels close, like it only happened yesterday. Other things are hazy, like looking through frosted glass." "Why do you ask?" Lily's eyes stayed on the fire. "Because I can't tell if my memories are real anymore, or if I just made them up." Margaret moved to the armchair opposite. "Lily, tell me one," she invited. The girl's small fingers tightened around her knees. "I remember a kitchen. It was bright. Not like this more, like the sun was coming in through big windows. I remember the smell of something sweet. Cinnamon, maybe, and a voice. Humming. I think it was my mother's, but..." Her throat caught. If I think about it too hard, the picture breaks apart. Margaret listened without interruption. "That's the way of certain memories," she murmured, "especially the ones tied to love or to loss." Lily glanced at her sharply. "So it could be real?" "It could be," Margaret said. "And even if parts are blurry, the feeling in them, that warmth you just described, that's a kind of truth too. Memories aren't always perfect photographs there, or like paintings. Colors stay even when the shapes change." Lily let out a breath she'd been holding, but her voice trembled again. "I also remember yelling, doors slamming, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break out of my chest. I don't like remembering that." Eyes softened. "We don't have to walk too far into those rooms yet," she said gently. "Memories like that can wait until you're ready to open them, and when you do, you don't have to open them alone."
Oh.
The girl's gaze flickered. Between Margaret's face and the fire, you make it sound like memories are places. "In a way they are," Margaret said with a faint smile. Some are gardens we can visit, others are locked attics, and some, her voice grew quieter, some are fields we walk through only once, because they hurt too much to cross. Again, Lily shifted, pulling the blanket higher around her. When I think about the good parts, I'm scared I'll lose them if I let the bad ones in too. Like the bad will take over. Margaret leaned forward slightly. That's why. We take it slow. You're learning how to keep the light and the shadows separate. How to remember the warmth without letting the storm swallow it. She hesitated, then reached for the teapot on the table, pouring Lily a cup of the chamomile blend she always made at night. They sat in the soft quiet again. The only sounds the fire's occasional pop and the faint swirl of snow beyond the walls. After a long sip, Lily asked, "What do you remember from before?" "Before you were here?" Margaret blinked, surprised by the turn. She rarely spoke of her own past. "I remember," she began slowly, "a place near the coast. The air always smelled faintly of salt. My father kept a small boat. My mother had a habit of leaving bread out for the gulls, even though my father said it would make them bold." She smiled faintly at the image. "I remember the day I left. It was raining so hard, the sea and sky were the same gray. I told myself I was leaving to help people. But truthfully, I think I was leaving to find a place that felt like home." "Did you find it?" Lily asked quietly. Margaret looked around the little cottage. The soft lamplight on the walls, the blanket draped over Lily's shoulders. "Eventually," she said, "but it took a while. Sometimes. Home is something you carry, and it waits for you to notice it." Lily didn't speak after that. She just stared at the fire, her face unreadable, but her body language softer, less tightly coiled. Margaret knew she was storing away every word, even if she wouldn't say so. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. The storm outside was easing, leaving a deep stillness in its wake. When Margaret finally suggested they turn in for the night, Lily didn't protest. She followed her to the small bedroom and slid under the quilts, her hair fanning over the pillow. Margaret was about to step away when Lily's voice stopped her. "If I remember more, can I tell you, even if it's not nice?" Margaret's answer was immediate, warm, and sure. Always. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the cottage, Lily fell asleep without curling into a tight ball, her breathing deep and even. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily from the black sky, covering the world in quiet white. The snow outside had grown thick again, draping the village in white silence. Inside the cabin, the fire whispered steadily, its glow spilling across the wooden floor like a blanket of light. Lily sat on the rug, knees tucked close, her hair spilling over her shoulder in loose strands. She looked smaller than she had when she first arrived at Margaret's door weeks ago, not in size, but in the way she held herself, cautious, thoughtful, measuring each word before it left her lips. Margaret had grown used to the stillness between them. It was a different kind of quiet than before, less brittle, more like a seed just beneath the soil, waiting for spring. She could feel it, the subtle shift in Lily's eyes, the way she seemed to listen now, not just out of politeness, but because something in her wanted to hear. On the small wooden table by the window lay a wool scarf. Margaret had knitted it herself, deep forest green, soft to the touch. She had left it there the night before, wondering if Lily might take it without being asked. She hadn't. But this morning, Margaret decided it was time. "Come here a moment." "Lily," she said gently. Lily hesitated, then stood, the hem of her worn dress brushing the tops of her stockings. She crossed the room slowly, as if each step toward Margaret was a question she wasn't sure how to ask. Margaret picked up the scarf and held it out. "I made this for you. It'll keep the wind from biting so deep." Lily's hands didn't move at first. She stared at the scarf as if it were a fragile thing, too fine for her fingers. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached out and brushed it with her fingertips. "It's soft," she whispered. "Go on," Margaret said. "Try it." Lily wrapped the scarf around her neck, but not like someone who had done it often. Was awkward, the ends uneven, the loop too loose. Margaret stepped forward, her hands gentle as she fixed it, tucking one side through, adjusting the knot so it sat snug but comfortable. When she stepped back, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Flicker of warmth in Lily's eyes. Not joy, not yet, but something near it. "Better," Margaret said softly. "Better," Lily echoed, voice so low it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Later that day, Margaret decided it was time to test something else. She had been thinking for weeks about how to draw Lily into the world beyond silence, how to coax movement, where there had only been stillness. She brought out the old gramophone from the cabinet. Its brass horn was tarnished, its base scratched from years of use. Lily watched with quiet curiosity as Margaret wound the handle, her brows knitting slightly at the faint, metallic worry sound. "This was my mother's," Margaret explained. "She believed music could do what words couldn't." The record Margaret chose was one she hadn't played in years, a soft waltz. Slow and sweeping, the kind that filled a room like the scent of fresh bread. She placed the needle, and the music bloomed into the air, rich and warm. Lily's head tilted slightly. Her eyes followed the spinning record, her breathing slowing as if she were listening, not just with her ears, but with every part of her. Margaret stepped forward and extended her hand. "May I have this dance?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lily didn't move. Her hands stayed at her sides, her feet rooted to the rug. "That's all right," Margaret said, lowering her hand, "then maybe just watch." Margaret began to move in slow circles, her feet gliding across the wooden floor, the music carrying her like a small boat on a calm river. She didn't try to dazzle, didn't try to instruct. She just let the waltz flow through her. She glanced toward Lily. The girl's eyes followed her steps, her fingers curling slightly as if they were keeping time in secret. "You know," Margaret said softly over the music, "when I was your age, I thought dancing was for other people. But my mother told me it was just another way to speak, for those moments when speaking is too hard." The music swelled, and Margaret, almost without thinking, reached out again. This time Lily didn't pull back. She placed her small, hesitant hand in Margaret's. Margaret guided her gently, just a single step forward, then back. At first, Lily's movements were stiff, her gaze fixed on her own feet. But Margaret didn't rush. "One step," Margaret whispered. "That's all you need to think about right now. Just one step." Then another. It was clumsy and uneven, but it was movement, and more than that, it was trust. When the record ended, the room felt changed. Not brighter exactly, but warmer, as if the fire had crept a little closer. Lily stepped back, almost shy again, but there was color in her cheeks now. She touched the scarf at her neck without thinking, as though it anchored her to this new moment. Margaret smiled. "You did well." Lily's lips parted as if she might say something, but instead she just gave a tiny nod. For the rest of the afternoon, Lily sat by the window, watching the snow fall. Margaret pretended to read, though she was really watching the girl out of the corner of her eye. Every so often, Lily's foot tapped faintly against the floor, almost in time with the echo of the waltz. It was a small thing, but to Margaret, it was the first true sign that Lily's spirit was stirring. The first step of the cure had been taken. And sometimes, Margaret thought, a single step is all you need to begin the journey home. The next morning broke with a crisp brightness that made the snow sparkle like it had been scattered with tiny diamonds. Samuel woke earlier than usual, the quiet hum of the wind outside sounding almost inviting, like it was urging him to step out into the day. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands together, feeling the faint excitement of a plan already stirring in his mind. Lily had shared so much of herself. These past weeks, her fears, her memories, the flickers of joy she still dared to hold on to. But everything had happened here in his cabin, his world. Samuel had begun to wonder what her world looked like, where she had been living, what she had been enduring before the knock on his door that snowy night. And so, she emerged from her room, her hair still slightly mussed from sleep, and her hands wrapped around a warm mug. He asked gently, "Lily, would you take me to where you've been staying?" Her eyes lifted from the cup, and for a moment she didn't answer. The hesitation was clear. Her gaze darted to the window, then back to him, as though the question had peeled back a layer she wasn't quite ready to face. "It's not a nice place," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but her grip on the mug tightened. "I imagine it's not," Samuel admitted softly. "But I think maybe it's important for me to understand, for us to talk about what comes." Next, there was a long silence between them, broken only by the faint hiss of the wood stove. Finally, she nodded once, slow and deliberate. "All right. But don't say I didn't warn you." They set out after breakfast, bundled in layers against the sharp morning air. Samuel's truck rumbled to life, its tires crunching over the thick snowpack as they made their way down the narrow road that led away from his secluded cabin. The world outside felt both endless and small. Towering pines gave way to open stretches of white, the mountains watching from a distance like ancient, silent witnesses. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She didn't speak much, and Samuel didn't press her. Instead, he let the silence settle, giving her the space to prepare herself. After nearly half an hour, the landscape began to change. The wide-open snowfields gave way to the edges of town, a place that, in summer, might have been quaint and alive with color. Now, in winter's grasp, it felt tired. The snow here was gray at the edges, pushed into lumpy piles by plows. Windows were shuttered, and the few people walking moved with their heads down, bodies wrapped tightly against the cold. Lily directed him to turn down a narrow street. The buildings here were old, their paint peeling, their roofs sagging. Under the weight of snow, finally she lifted a hand and pointed to a squat, weathered structure with a crooked sign that simply read, "Miller's Inn. This is it." She murmured. Samuel pulled up to the curb and killed the engine. They sat for a moment in the stillness, the quiet ticking of the truck's cooling engine filling the air between them. When they stepped out, cold seemed sharper here, as if it seeped up from the ground. The inn's door groaned when Lily pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and something faintly sour. The lighting was dim, a yellowish hue that made everything look older than it was. The man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper as they passed. Lily didn't greet him, and Samuel followed her down a narrow hallway, lined with thin, scuffed carpet. She stopped at a door near the end, and unlocked it with a key she pulled from her pocket. Inside, the room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a dresser, and a rickety chair. The bed was neatly made, but the blanket was thin, and a single window let in a pale sliver of light. There was no warmth here, not the kind a person could feel in their bones. "This is where you've been?" Samuel asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, stepping inside and crossing to the window. "I've been here since before I met you. Before that, I was at another place, but it wasn't much better." She rested her fingers on the cold glass. "Sometimes when it snowed, I could almost pretend it was pretty, but most of the time, it just felt like the world had forgotten me." Samuel moved slowly, taking in every detail, the worn edges of the dresser, the faint draft that slipped under the window frame, the quiet hum of a heater that was clearly struggling against the winter air. "I can see why you didn't want to bring me here," he said softly. Lily turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "It's not the place I wanted you to think of when you think of me. I wanted you to remember the cabin, the fire, the way things feel there." He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Lily, I don't care where you've been. What matters to me is where you're going, and I'd like to think it's somewhere better than this." Her eyes glistened, and she blinked quickly, as if brushing away the thought before it could settle too deeply. "Somewhere better," she repeated quietly. On the way back to the cabin, she was quieter than before, but the air between them felt different, not heavy with shame, but lighter, as though a weight had been shared. Samuel didn't need to ask if she was glad he had seen it. He could tell by the way her shoulders eased, just slightly as the miles passed. When they arrived home, the cabin felt warmer than ever. Lily slipped off her coat and boots, lingering near the fire while Samuel put on tea. She glanced over at him and said, almost shyly, "Thank you for not saying anything cruel, for just looking." He set the mugs on the table and joined her. "We can't heal the things we won't look at, Lily. That includes places, memories, and sometimes ourselves." For a long while, they sat, in silence, sipping tea, the snow falling softly outside. Samuel knew that this visit to her world, as bleak as it had been, was a step forward. Not a comfortable one, perhaps, but necessary. And as the firelight flickered across her face, he thought that maybe, just maybe, they were closer to finding a way forward together. Snowflakes whispered against the old cabin windows, and the fire in the hearth burned low, casting a softer, more fragile glow than usual. Michael had lit only 2 candles tonight, letting the shadows dance and drift along the walls. It wasn't because the power was out, he simply wanted the room to feel smaller, warmer, safer. Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands clasped around a mug of cocoa, steam curling against her face. She had been quieter than usual tonight, not because she had nothing to say, but because there was something deep that was stirring inside her. Michael sensed it immediately. It wasn't the silence of withdrawal. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump into the unknown. He poured himself another cup of tea and sat across from her. "Wow, you've been holding something in?" he said softly. His tone wasn't demanding, it was an invitation. Lily's eyes flickered toward him, then away. She took a sip from her mug, her knuckles tightening slightly around it. "Maybe." Michael leaned back in his chair, resting one ankle over his knee. "When you say maybe like that, it usually means yes." He smiled gently, as if trying to coax a flower to open. A faint, nervous laugh escaped her. "You notice everything, only the important things." For a long moment, the only sounds were the fire popping and the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Then, Lily put her mug down on the floor, carefully, like it might shatter too easily if she let it go too quickly. I used to sing," she said suddenly, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. Michael didn't react with surprise. He only nodded, leaning forward slightly. "You did?" "Yeah, all the time. At school, at church, even at this little community center my mom took me to. I wasn't great, but I loved it. It made me feel like..." She hesitated, searching for the words. "Like I was alive, like I mattered." "And then?" he asked gently. Her eyes lowered. And then the comments started. People laughed. said my voice was weird. I sounded like a little kid. One time someone recorded me without me knowing and posted it online. The caption said, "Listen to the dying cat." Her voice cracked slightly at the memory. After that, I never sang again, not even when I was alone. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. Words can be cruel, but they only have the power we give them. She looked at him sharply. It's not that easy, I know, he admitted. It's not easy at all. I also know that sometimes the thing they tried to take away from you is the exact thing that can bring you back to yourself. Lily stared into the fire. I wouldn't even know where to start. Michael stood, moving toward the small bookshelf in the corner. From it, he pulled an old guitar, the wood polished. From years of use, he carried it over and sat on the edge of the rug just a few feet from her. You don't have to sing for me, he said. Not yet, but let me play something. Just listen. He began strumming softly, the melody slow, warm, almost hypnotic. It wasn't a song she recognized. It felt like one she should have known all her life, gentle notes, rising and falling like breathing. The firelight flickered against his face, and his eyes stayed on the strings, his hands moving without hesitation. Something loosened in her chest. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until a shaky sigh escaped her lips. Michael looked up, meeting her gaze. When you're ready, you can hum along. Not for me. For you. Her throat tightened. Can't. Yes, you can. Just a little. She hesitated, then closed her eyes. At first, nothing came. But then, almost without her realizing, a faint sound slipped out. Just one note, soft and unsure, like a bird testing the air before flight. Michael's smile was barely visible, but his strumming grew lighter, making space for her voice. She added another note, then another. Soon, she was humming quiet, trembling but steadying with each breath. Or it wasn't singing yet, but it was something. When the song ended, the room felt different, fuller, alive. Lily opened her eyes slowly, her cheeks flushed. I haven't done that in years. And yet, here you are, Michael said gently. For the first time in their months of conversations, Lily didn't look away when she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, fragile one, but it was real. Michael leaned back, resting the guitar beside him. That's what a breakthrough feels like. Not a giant leap, just one step you thought you couldn't take. She hugged her knees to her chest. Do you think I could sing again? For real? I think Michael said that your voice is still yours? And no one, not the people from your past, not the comments, not even your fear, has the right to keep it from you. Her throat tightened again, but this time, it wasn't from holding back tears. It was from the way hope felt. When it tried to fit into a heart that hadn't made room for it in years, they sat in silence for a while, letting the fire warm them both. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white. Inside, something else was happening, a quiet thaw. And in that small cabin, on that quiet night, Lily realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start reclaiming the parts of herself she thought were gone forever. The sun was still low when I stepped outside, at its pale light glancing off the frost-dusted grass. The air had that particular stillness that only comes on cold mornings, a silence broken only by the occasional trill of a distant bird. I'd been out here many mornings before, but today felt different. Today Lily was walking beside me. She had insisted on wearing her long wool coat, even though I told her the garden wasn't far. The coat seemed almost too big for her, and the way it wrapped around her slight frame made her seem even smaller. Still, her steps were steadier than I'd seen them before. Tell me, I said softly as we passed the first row of bare rose bushes, have you ever seen a garden in winter? Before? She shook her head. Not like this. The gardens I've seen in winter were just dead. I smiled faintly. It may look asleep, but it's not dead. The roots are still alive under the soil, waiting for spring. Everything here is just resting. Lily's gaze wandered over the frosted flower beds, the curled brown leaves, and the still pond that mirrored the pale sky. She stopped at the edge of the pond and knelt down, gloved fingers hovering over the thin crust of ice. It's fragile, she whispered, almost to herself. Like some people, I murmured. Not sure if she heard me. We walked slowly along the gravel path, our footsteps crunching in rhythm. Every so often she would point out something. A bird darting between branches.
Ow.
The way frost clung to the edges of the hedges, a single stubborn bloom that had refused to let go of life, even in the cold. This place feels safe, she said at one point. I turned to her. Do you feel safe here? She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. But it's not just the garden. I kept walking, winding toward the old stone bench under the arbor. I'd always loved this spot in spring. Wisteria would drape down like curtains, and in autumn the leaves would turn gold. Now the vines were bare, but even so, The bench felt like a place made for quiet talks. We sat. The stone was cold, even through my coat, but I didn't mind. Lily tucked her coat tighter around her and tilted her head back, watching a cloud drift lazily overhead. I used to love gardens when I was little, she said finally. There was one near the house I grew up in. My mother used to take me there. Before everything changed, I waited. I'd learned not to rush her. She used to tell me each flower had its own personality. Roses were proud, tulips were shy, daisies were happy. I used to think the flowers knew me too. She gave a short laugh, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I haven't thought about that in years. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees. Maybe the flowers are still waiting for you to visit them again. Her lips curved slightly. Maybe. A light breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of earth beneath the frost. We sat in silence, letting it wrap around us. There was something about being here, away from the walls of the house, that made it easier for her to speak and easier for me to listen. After a while, "Really?" The question caught me off guard, though I should have expected it. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because I see you. I see the part of you that hasn't given up yet. And I know what it's like to feel like the world has turned its back on you." Her eyes searched mine, as if testing the truth of my words. Whatever she saw seemed to ease something in her. She looked away again, toward the frozen pond. "I don't remember the last time someone said they saw me," she said quietly. We stayed out there until the sun rose higher, softening the frost into dewdrops. By the time we made our way back to the house, her cheeks were flushed. There was a faint light in her eyes that hadn't been there when we stepped outside. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't even a turning point, not yet. But it was something, a breath, a seed, the first stirring under the soil. And I knew, as I watched her walk a few steps ahead of me, that the garden had done what I'd hoped. It had whispered too. Heard the same promise it had always whispered to me: spring always comes. The first snow of the season had begun to fall again, drifting in slow, lazy spirals outside the window. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, a knitted shawl over her shoulders, the crackle of the fireplace filling the quiet. She had grown used to the soft hum of Lily's presence over the past weeks, the gentle way she moved around the house, the way her eyes seemed a little less guarded, the faint ghost of a smile that appeared when she thought no one was watching. But tonight felt different. Lily stood in the doorway of the living room, her small hands hidden behind her back. She looked nervous, as though she were about to do something she had practiced many times but still feared she might get wrong. Can I give you something?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret looked up, surprise flickering in her gaze. "Of course, dear. Ain't what? Is it?" For a moment, Lily hesitated. Then she stepped forward and placed a small bundle in Margaret's lap. It was wrapped in a scrap of fabric, worn but clean, tied with a piece of twine. Margaret's fingers were gentle as she untied the knot, unfolding the cloth to reveal a delicate charm bracelet. It was made from odd bits of things: a button, a tiny key, a shell, and a small glass bead that caught the firelight like a drop of captured sky. "I made it," Lily said quickly, her cheeks pink. "It's not, store stuff. But each piece means something." Margaret's heart ached at the sight. The bracelet wasn't just a trinket. It was a map of Lily's memories, a patchwork of her journey. "What do they mean, love?" Margaret asked softly, turning the bracelet in her hands. Lily perched on the edge of the ottoman, her eyes following the sway of the charms. She pointed to the small shell. "That one. My mom found it on the beach once. We kept it in a jar." Her voice grew quieter. "I kept it when she was gone." Margaret touched the shell with care, feeling the smooth curve under her fingers. "And the button. It was from my old coat. The one I wore when I had to leave home." Lily's lips pressed together, as though holding back more words, and this little key. A tiny smile tugged at Lily's mouth. "That was to a diary I had. I lost the diary, but I kept the key anyway." Margaret's eyes lingered on the last charm, the blue bead that shimmered like a drop of water. "And this," Lily hesitated. And for a moment her gaze seemed far away. "That one I found in the snow. It was the day I came here. I was cold and scared, and I saw it glinting near your porch. I picked it up because I thought maybe it was lucky." The words settled in Margaret's heart like something both heavy and precious. She reached forward, taking Lily's small hand in hers. "It is lucky," Margaret murmured, "because it brought you here." For the first time, Lily didn't look away from the warmth in Margaret's eyes. Margaret fastened the bracelet around her own wrist, the charms clinking softly. "I will wear it always," she promised. They sat quietly for a while, the fire painting them in its gold light. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world in white. After a time, Margaret spoke again, her voice thoughtful. You've given me something, Lily. Something you didn't even know you were giving. Lily tilted her head. What? Margaret smiled faintly. Hope. You reminded me that life still has room for new beginnings, even when we think all the doors have closed. Lily's fingers curled into the edge of the ottoman cushion. I didn't mean to, she said quietly. Sometimes the most important things we give without meaning to, Margaret replied. For the rest of the evening they talked. About small things, the smell of cinnamon and baking bread, the sound of rain on tin roofs, the way cats always seem to know when you're sad. But there was something else in the air now, something unspoken but understood. This wasn't just a woman helping a lost girl anymore. No, this was a bond. When it grew late, Margaret walked Lily to the small room they had made her own. At the doorway, Lily hesitated, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Margaret's waist in a quick, almost startled hug. Good night, Alt, she murmured, before slipping into her room. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her hand resting where Lily had hugged her, feeling the quiet echo of it in the flicker of the hallway light. The bracelet glinted on her wrist. She smiled, not the polite smile of habit, but the kind that came from somewhere deeper. The gift was small, yes, but it was also everything. The snow fell softly that year, quieter than usual, as if the whole world had agreed to keep its voice down. The little cabin at the edge of the woods still stood, warm light glowing from its windows at dusk, but it was different now. There was no sharp echo of loneliness inside. Lily had been gone for many months. It's not gone in the way that used to mean lost. She was gone to her own life, her own home in the city, her own future. The visits had grown fewer, but never ceased. Each letter she sent smelled faintly of city rain and pressed flowers, as if she wanted to bring the two worlds together, the one she came from and the one she had found. That winter, I spent my days, much as before, tending the fire, cooking simple meals, walking to the stream when the snow wasn't too deep. But I was not the same man. The silence no longer pressed down on me. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the calm after. A storm of silence that had been earned. One morning, the first heavy snow came. I opened the door to see the trees bowing under their white burdens. The air was sharp, clean, almost too bright to look at. And for the first time in years, I didn't find myself wishing for a knock at the door. I was content in the knowing Lily was out there living. I thought of her first winter here, the way she stood, trembling in the doorway, eyes darting like a cornered bird, the way she didn't speak for days, the way her hands shook when I asked if she wanted tea. That Lily seemed a distant shadow now. The Lily I knew today laughed easily, spoke with confidence, and met my gaze without flinching. The cure, if there was such a thing, had not been some magic I'd performed. It had been time. It had been firelight and shared bread, long silences and gentle questions. It had been letting her tell her story only when she was ready, and listening without trying to fix it. It had been love, though I had never said the word aloud. Sometimes, when the wind would pick up and whip around the cabin, I would hear it again, the faint sound of her voice, the laugh that came from deep in her chest. I had thought that when she left, the cabin would feel unbearably empty again. But it didn't. It felt full of memories of warmth, of something that couldn't be snowed over. That February, a letter arrived. Her handwriting was steadier now. She wrote about her work at the small bookstore, about the cat she had taken in, about the little balcony garden she was coaxing to life. She wrote that she still kept the red scarf I'd given her, the one she'd worn on our walks to the frozen stream, and at the bottom of the page, she'd written, "You saved me." I don't think I ever told you that properly. I read that line over and over until the fire had burned low. Saved her. No, that wasn't the word. I had only given her what she already had inside her, a chance to remember she was worth saving. As the days lengthened toward spring, the snow began to retreat from the edges of the woods. I sat on the cabin steps, watching the meltwater carve little paths through the dirt. The sun was warmer now, the air carrying the faint smell of damp earth. For years, I had marked my life in seasons, winters of aching loneliness, springs that felt too sharp, summers that passed in a blur, and autumns that seemed to prepare me for more emptiness. But now, seasons felt like a story with chapters worth turning. On the first day, the stream broke free of its ice. I walked there alone. The air was alive with the sound of water running again. I could almost hear Lily's boots crunching beside mine, her breath visible in the cold. I imagined her stopping mid-step to look at something mouse under melting snow, the way sunlight pierced the ice. I smiled, knowing she would have noticed those things even without me. I leaned down, letting my fingers touch the icy water. It was colder than I remembered, almost painful. But then, pain had a way of making you feel the truth of being alive. That night, the last heavy snow of the year came. It was the kind of snow that seemed to fall without end, muffling the world to nothing. I sat by the fire with a mug of tea, watching it pile up outside. It would melt soon enough. The knock at the door never came that winter, I realized, with a strange ache of joy that I no longer waited for it. Lily had walked out into her own life, and I had stayed here in mine. And yet, the threads between us still held strong, invisible, unbreakable. When spring came fully, I would take the path to the village again, perhaps visit the market, maybe even walk further than I had in years. Life was not finished with me yet. For now, I sat and watched the fire burn low, the snow drifting down outside, the world quiet and whole. And for the first time in many winters, I felt no hunger for something beyond this moment. Because sometimes, the cure isn't about bringing someone to stay. It's about helping them find the strength to leave while knowing they'll always carry a piece of you with them. And in that way, perhaps I was never truly alone again.